Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. In today's episode, we are going to get into talking about what our holiday break or winter break or whatever your break is called, Christmas break, what our winter break training plans should look like. So I have been having this conversation with my dancers in the clinic a lot over the last week or two as we sort of transition to the holiday break. And I've also been getting some questions from people on social media reaching out and asking, what should I be doing? I have this break from dance over the holidays. What should my training plan look like? What types of exercises should I be doing? And all of that kind of stuff. So we are going to dive into that episode today. I just want to, first of all, recognize that there are people listening to this podcast from all over the world. And I actually just got kind of the podcast platform or hosting system that I use does a little kind of Wrapped, similar to like Spotify Wrapped, but based on like podcast kind of statistics for the year. And super interestingly to me, the second most listened to that's not right. I'm saying that wrong. The place that has the second highest number of listeners is actually Sydney, Australia, which I thought was super, super interesting. So shout out to all of you guys who are listening from Sydney. But I also just want to say I recognize that you guys actually aren't heading into the same type of a holiday or a winter break that we are here in North America. So for all of you who are heading into your summer break in Australia, I'm going to suggest that you go and listen to episode 31 of the podcast. I will link it in the show notes here, but you can also just scroll back. Episode 31, and it is called Off-Season Training Plans for Dancers. And that episode is going to be more relevant to you because if you're moving into your summer break, if you're somewhere in the southern hemisphere, your break is going to be longer than a couple of weeks. So you're moving into like sort of your bigger break and it might be 6 weeks off or whatever it is. So I would recommend go listen to episode 31, Off-Season Training Plans. Then if you want to come back and listen to this episode for kind of a winter break and that kind of thing. But like I said, if your break is longer, this episode's not going to be as relevant to you, but that episode will be a good one for you to listen to. So I just want to throw that out there, first of all, recognizing that there are people listening from all over the world. But here in North America, and especially where I am in Vancouver, we are heading into our winter break. Most studios are starting to wrap up. This episode is going to come out on a Tuesday, and this is generally the last week of classes for most dancers. A lot of the nutcrackers and such have already wrapped. Some of them are happening this coming weekend, and then people will be on some sort of a holiday break. So I want to get into what your training plans should look like over the course of your holiday break. And in reality, it should look like nothing. And that's kind of all I have to say. No, I'm joking. If your break is, let's say 2 weeks, give or take a few days, or less, your training plan should look like nothing. Your training plan should look like rest and recovery. Now, if you're somebody who's been dealing with a bit of like a niggling injury and you have some rehab exercises you're supposed to be doing or things like that, some like physio exercises, you absolutely should continue to do those during the Christmas break. But in terms of our actual training plans or like what dance classes we should be doing or how many classes we should be doing, what we should be doing in the gym, all of that kind of thing, we should be doing basically nothing. So I'll say that again. If your winter break is 2 weeks or less, which is going to be most of the dancers we're dealing with, you should be taking that as an actual break and focusing on rest and recovery and not worrying about trying to fit training into your holiday plans. Use it as an opportunity to relax, spend time with friends, spend time with family, enjoy whatever holiday traditions and celebrations you like to participate in. You should not be trying to fit in training if your break is that length of time. Now, I know that there's a couple of specific scenarios that exist for certain groups of dancers, and that's a lot of what I've been getting questions about from people on social media. So I am going to dive into some specific scenarios, but if you are a dancer, and it does not matter if you are a recreational dancer or a competitive dancer or a professional dancer or whatever type of dancer you want to kind of categorize yourself as, if your holiday break is 2 weeks or less, give or take a day or two, you should be resting and recovering and not doing anything as far as winter break training plans go. If you want some ideas or things to specifically focus on when we think about rest and recovery or want more information about rest and recovery, there is a podcast episode entirely about that. And that is episode number 9. It's called Rest and Recovery. So if you fall into that category, I would suggest turning off this podcast episode right now and go listen to number 9 again. If you have not already listened to it, go listen to it for sure. Even if you listened to it when it first came out, that was like a year ago. So go back and listen to that and you'll get ideas of some things for rest and recovery. But if your winter break is within that 2-week time frame, you can stop listening to the rest of this podcast episode. Now, like I said, there are some specific circumstances or populations where maybe this is a little bit different. And so if you have a winter break that is longer than 2 weeks, and the populations I'm thinking about the most are, I have some like university or college level dancers who are in dance major programs who some of them actually get nearly a month, or if not even a little bit more than a month, depending on where you're going to school. A lot of the American colleges seem to have a little bit longer of a winter break. And I think it probably depends on at what point your exams wrapped up and that type of thing. So if you fall into a category where your winter break is longer than 2 weeks, then we actually do want to start to think about, okay, what should we be doing? And some professional dancers will perhaps fall into this category as well. Not tons that I know of, but I do know a few who, for whatever reason, may get just a little bit longer of a winter break this year. So if you are a dancer, and like I said, it's going to be a lot of college dancers might fall into this category, you may want to consider a slightly different schedule for your winter break. And for dancers who fall into that category, we still want to focus on rest and recovery. It is still your break from an intense program. If you're doing like a BFA or something like that in dance, those are pretty intensive programs. You're dancing a lot of hours. There's a lot going on. You've probably just wrapped up some sort of an end of semester showcase or something like that. We do still want to prioritize rest and recovery. So the first 2 weeks of your break is likely going to look exactly the same as every other dancer who should be prioritizing rest and recovery during those 2 weeks. So I would say the initial 2 weeks of your break, prioritize or focus on rest and recovery, and don't worry about trying to fit in any sort of classes or training or anything like that. Then if your break is longer than that, so if we're like into like week 3, week 4, potentially even like week 5, we do want to make sure that we are doing something during that time, because when we head back in January or whenever your classes go back, we want to make sure that we haven't sort of gone from 100 down to 0 and then straight back up to 100. So we do want to start to think about doing something. But during this time, this is not the same as off season. So if you've listened to me talk about periodization within the dance season and all of those topics or concepts before, you'll know that in the off season, we really want to focus on building foundational sort of strength and fitness, cardiovascular fitness, muscular strength, muscular endurance, all of those things. Winter break is not the time to focus on those things necessarily. So after we have our initial 2-week break from dance, when we're looking at, okay, we want to get back into things, really what we're looking at is just like easing yourself back in a little bit so you don't go from doing absolutely nothing back to 100 miles an hour instantaneously. And that can look different for different people. If you have access to classes or to studio space, it could look like doing a class maybe 3 times a week for those weeks, something like that, 2 times, 3 times. It does not have to be super intense. You do not need to be dancing 6 days a week, and you do not need to be dancing hours and hours and hours every day, but you might want to do something to stay kind of, quote unquote, dance ready or work those muscles, and that would be totally fine. depending on where you are going home to, maybe you're on vacation, things like that, you might not have access to dance-specific kind of training or dance-specific conditioning, and that is also totally fine. You could choose instead to focus on other activities and more gym-based training sessions. And if that is the case, again, this could just be like 3 times a week. It does not need to be super intense. It is just to maintain what is, kind of fitness levels and things like that. But you're not looking at trying to increase strength or increase endurance or anything like that during this time. It is literally a maintenance thing. So it could be a couple times a week, 3 times a week, let's say, and just going in and doing I will call it a full body workout. So you're not trying to do a super heavy loaded leg day or things like that, because again, we're not expecting to see massive muscular strength increases in this time. It is literally more about just maintenance and making sure that we're staying kind of a little bit conditioned. So I would say if you're using a gym program as opposed to going in and doing classes and kind of dancing, then going to the gym 3 times a week, do a little bit of cardio as a warm-up potentially that can look like whatever you enjoy, whether that's cycling, treadmill, rowing machine, it doesn't matter. Pick something that you like. And then follow that with kind of a full body general sort of like strengthening program, or muscular endurance is really probably more what you're actually focusing on. So it's going to be, repetitions are going to be probably somewhere between 10 and 15 repetitions, and you're doing maybe 2 to 3 sets of an exercise. So we're really more into that kind of muscular endurance side of things. And that will be totally adequate for you to head back into a dance program after having sort of a few weeks off. So again, if your winter break, your holiday break is longer than 2 weeks, so it's somewhere in that neighborhood of 3 to 4 weeks, after an initial 2-week break where you get to rest and recover and prioritize that, then you're going to get back into doing some maintenance type of physical activity. And that can look like dance classes if you want, but it can also just look like gym exercises or things like that if you don't have access to it. I would try and refrain from going straight back into things like 6 days a week. We still want to focus on that rest and recovery during this period of time. Like, it is your time in between 2 intense times of the season. So like if you're in kind of a university college dance program, you're going to be going into another intensive semester. So you're not looking to like exhaust yourself during that break when you're kind of maintaining fitness. So, let's say you have 4 weeks off. That 3rd week of your break, so first 2 weeks you're doing nothing. That 3rd week of your break, maybe you do something 3 days a week. And then the 4th week, maybe you do something 4 days a week, but I still wouldn't go back into like 6 days a week, because that's going to happen. You have plenty of time for that once you actually get back into your dance program. Same for professional dancers. You can kind of slowly ramp it back up a little bit if you want, if you feel inclined to do more than 2 or 3 days a week of something, but it is not necessary. You could just do, say, 3 days a week for a couple weeks, and then that when you're back in a company setting, it's going to be back to 5 or 6 days a week or whatever it is that your regular rehearsal and class schedule is. So that is one scenario of people if your winter break is more than, say, 2 weeks long. And like I said, that happens in a few cases, but for the majority of who we're working with, or who I'm working with in terms of studio dancers who are competitive dancers or recreational dancers or things like that, your break is usually 2 weeks or less, in which case you're just going to focus on rest and recovery. The other scenario that I've been getting a lot of questions about are the dancers who have something coming up immediately following their winter break. And in the case of where we live in Vancouver, and this is why this question has been coming up a lot, is there is a competition that happens, and every year it is scheduled right in the beginning of January. And every year this becomes like hugely problematic when we're looking at trying to incorporate periodization and look at, having a winter break and things like that. But there is a big competition that happens in Seattle that first weekend in January. And this year it's actually slightly later than normal. A lot of times it actually happens before our winter break here has even ended. So it's like happening during winter break. So dancers who are participating in that competition are actually competing before they've even returned back to dance classes. It is slightly better this year. It is happening the weekend, or it starts midweek or whatever, but it is like the week that classes return. So it's, a few days later. It's not much later. And this can be, or is, I should say, hugely problematic and really challenging when we're then looking at how do we balance this with what we know about training and rest and recovery and periodization. And so really, when it comes down to it, I really, really, really wish that competitions just would not schedule things like this. And like I said, this is something that happens every single year. It is always problematic, and I don't know that they're ever going to change it unless people stop registering to go to it. But that's also likely not going to happen just because of it being one of the only opportunities for people to participate sort of close to home. If people don't go to this one in Seattle, then you're looking at flying to various locations all over the US or across Canada or that type of thing. And so it is, like I said, really quite problematic. And I just wish competitions would, or even conventions, because I know there's some conventions that happen really early in January too. I really wish that they would consider this when they are planning and scheduling their dates in the calendar year, because it is not necessarily the dancer's fault that this is when things are being scheduled for, but it is less than ideal when we look at the timing of things. So if you are one of these dancers or a dance parent, because some of the people who've been reaching out have been dance parents asking, what do we do about this? I will speak to this a little bit right now, but honestly, in an ideal world, we just would not have these things happening when dancers, it's like one of the only times in a dance season when dancers actually can and should be having a break. And so having competition scheduled either during that break or immediately after that break finishes is really problematic when it comes to then being able to balance rest and recovery for these dancers. But like I said, if people are registered and they're going, then we want to talk about what that potentially looks like. And so in the case of this year, and I'm going to talk really specifically about what the dates and timing look like this year, I still would prioritize dancers having rest and recovery immediately, like when classes end. So I'm actually going to use specific dates because I think this might be helpful for some people. But if you are listening to this episode in the future, just realize that this is for like this year specifically, and you can kind of like use the same information, but just like how it falls on the calendar this year. So like I said, most studios, today is a Tuesday, most studios will be wrapping up either Friday this week, which is December 20th, or December 21st, which is the Saturday. That will be sort of like the end of like classes. I then would love to see all of the dancers, even if they are competing that first weekend in January, or I guess it's like technically the second weekend, but early January. I would want to see those dancers have a break from, we'll call it December 21st, until after New Year's. So it is not going to be quite 2 weeks, but it is going to hopefully end up being about 10 days. So if we look at, say, a studio wraps on December 21st, if they're coming back after New Year's, January 1st is a holiday, they'd be coming back into potentially training or rehearsing or whatever, January 2nd. So it is not a full 2 weeks, but it is something. It is better than nothing. It's more rest or more of a break than a lot of dancers often get. And so if I were the teacher or the studio owner or whoever, and this is like, the reality I was left with and how I would plan it, that is when I would give dancers that break. Rather than people have kind of asked me, should we just keep those dancers dancing up until like, the 24th or whatever? And I would say, no, we want those dancers to have a break. Dancers are burnt out right now. Dancers are tired. Dancers need a break. Teachers are tired and need a break right now too. So classes are going to end 20th, 21st, whatever. Dancers should have a break until after New Year's. Then when we think about sort of January 2nd to, I actually don't know exactly what day this competition starts on. It might be the 8th. It might be the 9th. It's something like that. I can't remember exactly what the date is. But then we have maybe not quite a week, but maybe close to a week where dancers can like kind of start to get back into training. Again, this is still part of the winter break. They're still going to be off school at this point. School goes back, I believe, on the 6th this year for us here. So these dancers are still off, but if you want to bring those dancers in for extra rehearsals, that would be the time to do it. And in this case, again, I don't think these dancers need to be dancing really intensively and like a lot of hours and a lot of days in a row necessarily. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that the competition starts on the 8th, because I feel like that's like the date I have in my head. So if we have between the 2nd and the 8th, we can have those dancers maybe having, let's say, 4 rehearsals over that time period. And so those rehearsals are maybe going to be an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours max. I don't think they need to be dancing more than that during that time. It is enough time for them to rehearse, for them to feel confident going into the competition without then also overtraining them, risking exhaustion and things like that. Because the other thing we need to keep in mind when we think about periodization and how we apply it to dance is that concept of tapering and sort of deloading and tapering before we go into a major event. And so in this case, this isn't exactly tapering because the break is going to happen a little bit earlier than that because it's going to correspond to like Christmas and New Year's. But that also doesn't mean that we want to go in and be training at 110% in the days leading into the competition. We still want to keep in mind that concept of tapering. So having them have a few rehearsals between, let's call it January 2nd and January 8th, but that are relatively short in intensity and not necessarily every single day during that time period, I think is very realistic and probably like, the best we can do in terms of prioritizing rest and recovery. If you are interested and haven't listened to the episode on tapering in terms of like how we would normally recommend we go, like we taper before going into major events, there is a podcast episode on that as well. It is called Tips for Tapering, I believe. It is episode, hold on one sec. It's episode 26. So I'll also put that one in the show notes if you want to check that one out. So again, this isn't exactly tapering, but it's kind of a similar concept to that, where we're going to still give those dancers that break. So they have a bit of a winter break, a little bit of rest and recovery, but then realizing that dancers aren't probably going to feel confident going straight in from doing nothing into a competition. From a purely physical perspective, in terms of like looking at like physical parameters like strength, endurance, things like that, it is not necessary for these dancers to keep training during the break. Like they're not going to lose any of their strength, technique, anything like that. That isn't going to happen in that period of time. But I do know that dancers from like a confidence standpoint are not going to want to go into a competition having just had, 2 full weeks off and not danced at all. So I do think it's important that those dancers do get a chance to have a few classes, a few rehearsals, whatever you want to call them, before they go into that competition, but still trying to balance that with the idea that their winter break should focus on rest and recovery. So I hope that is helpful. Like I said, this is a really specific situation just because of this one competition that happens early, but I do know that there's other conventions and competitions that often happen really early and happen right in the beginning of January. So even if you're not in Vancouver and you're not going to this competition in Seattle, it's still something that you can potentially apply if you have dancers in this situation. And like I said, this year's slightly less bad because the competition doesn't actually happen like as early in January, just the way the calendar falls. It's like a couple of days later, but some years it's happening literally like starting on January 2nd. And so then it's even more challenging. But we still, like I said, want to try and prioritize rest and recovery. When dancers have periods of time that are less than 2 weeks off, we know that they are not going to lose any of their conditioning. We don't need to worry about them losing technique, losing conditioning, getting, quote unquote, out of shape. So really we want to focus on that rest and recovery. And then if they are going into a competition, giving them some opportunities to rehearse and train leading into that so that they have the confidence going into that event that they feel good in their bodies. So hopefully that is helpful for everyone in terms of thinking about what you are going to prioritize this holiday season when it comes to your training plans. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, please reach out. I would love to hear from you. And thanks so much for listening today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.